Welcome back to Psyche and Singularity. I'm going over my book, Psyche and Singularity, Jungian Psychology, and Holographic String Theory. So in this episode, I'm going to continue to compare near-death experiences with holographic string theory. And in the previous video, I showed the biggest parallel that I discuss in the book between Carl Jung's near-death experience of the cosmic horizon and Leonard Suskind's holographic string theory. And the biggest correlation there was that all of the information of the past, present, and future is recorded at each point of the encompassing horizon of the cosmos, from where the three-dimensional illusion of cubic space that we inhabit in our daily lives is projected by a thread. So that is holographic string theory, and that is also what Carl Jung said he experienced during his near-death experience in 1944. So in this video, continuing this comparison of near-death experiences in string theory, I'll talk about Stanislav Grof's work and the cardiologist Pim van Lommel. He discusses the near-death experiences. He encountered people who had near-death experiences after they had heart attacks, and so that interested him in the topic, and he wrote a book as a cardiologist about the plausibility of these experiences and what it implies about the cosmos. And as we'll see, he agrees with Stanislav Grof, the transpersonal psychologist, that the implications are that consciousness is interwoven with the fabric of the cosmos. Van Lommel says specifically at the quantum vacuum. Grof mentions the same theory, which they can both link back to David Bohm's holographic interpretation of quantum mechanics. So another thing I'll be talking about in this video is the tunnel vision experience people talk about when they have these near-death experiences. They rise above their body, they look down from above, and then they sense themselves accelerating through space until it seems as if they're traveling down a dark tunnel toward an extremely attractive and brilliant point of light, into which they feel that if they were to unite with it, they would become one with everything and gain knowledge of all of the universe, past, present, and future. So I'll compare that experience, which is synonymous with the near-death experience, this light at the end of the tunnel, to relativity theory, the aberration effect predicted by special relativity, and the gravitational lensing effect predicted by general relativity, which says the aberration effect says if you could travel at light speed through space-time, all of the light of the universe, even light directly behind you, would get curled into a smaller and smaller disk, and as you approach the speed of light, it would be all of the light in the universe would be condensed in a single point of light at the end of a dark tunnel. That's how you would perceive the universe. And similarly, according to the gravitational lensing effect, if you were inside a black hole looking out, you would see all of the light of the universe, even the light directly behind the black hole, pulled into a single point at the end of a dark tunnel. So the implication I'm saying is that the psyche is space-time, and when we die, our psyche, which I'm equating with the gravitational singularity, rises out of the body because it is space-time. It experiences the exponential expansion of space-time, gradually accelerating and then faster and faster, and that the psyche experiences what an object traveling through space-time at light speed would experience, or what space-time itself experiences, that is, as it expands toward the speed of light, and it achieves the speed of light at the cosmic horizon, which I am saying is the point of no return that people talk about during a near-death experience. So I will now go into the book here. So Stanislav Grof, I'll read now from Richard Tarnas. I've been reading from his book, The Passion of the Western Mind and Cosmos and Psyche. In his book, he says, well, I forget if this was The Passion of the Western Mind or Cosmos and Psyche, but Richard Tarnas says, the most epistemologically significant development in the recent history of depth psychology, and indeed the most important advance in the field as a whole since Freud and Jung themselves, has been the work of Stanislav Grof. So, Stanislav Grof took Carl Jung's psychology of the collective unconscious mind, and he furthered it into what he called the perinatal domain. So in addition to the subconscious of our personal biography that Sigmund Freud pointed out, we have a collective unconscious, which is populated by the archetypes that Jung talked about following Plato. And what Grof said is that there's another level, the perinatal, which is kind of a intermediary between the personal biography and the collective unconscious. The perinatal refers to the memories of birth and the gestation process. And how he discovered this was through psychedelic research. So Stanislav Grof got his MD in psychiatry in 1957 in Czechoslovakia. And he then, as soon as he got his medical license, he volunteered for an experiment involving LSD and a stroboscopic light that they attached to his head. They gave him LSD, the psychedelic drug, and then after 3 hours into the trip, when the drug achieves peak potency, they strapped an enormous strobe light to his head, and they were trying to entrain his brain waves to the frequency of the light. And so this is how he describes it. He says that it was a light that was like millions of suns. He was quoting the Bhagavad Gita. And he said, my consciousness was catapulted out of my body, and I lost connection with the research assistant, with the clinic, with Prague, with the planet. And I had this amazing experience of my consciousness just embracing everything. And he goes on to say, I actually became the physical universe somehow. I had the feeling I had been back to the Big Bang. So that is very similar to the experience that Carl Jung had after his heart attack in 1944. So what really shocks me about this whole thing is that, according to Richard Tarnas, who I accept as an authority on cultural history, there was 3 major psychologists in the 20th century, one of whom is still living in the 21st century. That's Freud, Jung, and Stanislav Grof. Of those 3, 2 of them had out-of-body experiences during which they felt as if they had united with everything, the entire universe, specifically at the outermost border of the universe. So is that just a chance freak coincidence, or were these 2 great pioneers of psychology experiencing reality? As they both said they were. They said, we saw Jung in the previous video say there was nothing subjective about it. It was absolutely objectively real, and he had no doubts about it. What makes me believe him more than I might otherwise is the fact that it so closely parallels exactly what Leonard Susskind describes the cosmic horizon to be. That is where the past, the present, and the future of the entire universe are interwoven at each point, and from which they are projected inward. So I want to read here from Stanislav Grof, and he's just describing the universe. He says, think of the universe. I mean, this is Leonard Susskind, and I'm comparing it to what Stanislav Grof experienced. So Leonard Susskind says, think of the universe as a series of concentric shells with us at the center. By looking deeper and deeper, we are, in effect, running the movie of the universe backward. So ultimately, the farther you go out in space, the farther you go back in time until you reach the birth of the universe at the horizon of the cosmos, where the space-time is expanding at the speed of light. And this is what Susskind says about that. He says that light does not seem to be coming from a boundary of space. Rather, it seems to come from a boundary of time, from what appears to be a Big Bang taking place in the past. So that is what many people who have had these near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences induced by LSD, for example, in Stanislav Grof's case, experience. Becoming one with the past, the present, and the future of the whole universe, specifically at the outermost horizon. Now, this entire book, Psyche and Singularity, is based on the theory that Carl Jung worked out with Wolfgang Pauli, that each law of psychology should be mirrored by a law of physics, because mind and matter both emerge from the underlying collective unconscious, or the archetypes, which they coined a term psychoid to describe them. It's neither psychic nor material because it's the source and the boundary of both. So you should look for parallels between the laws of psychology and the laws of physics. And I'm saying that those parallels are most noticeable in these extreme psychological or parapsychological experiences of near-death experiences and psychedelic experiences. And what I think is especially important about the psychedelic experiences is that they are reproducible to a certain degree. So, okay, you had a near-death experience. Well, I can't confirm whether you had that or not because I can't become you, and it's a private thing. Others have said they've had them. Okay, that's more evidence, but again, each of those people, they can't reproduce those results exactly like they had them, the way you would like in a scientific experiment. The double-slit experiments in quantum mechanics can be reproduced anywhere, but Carl Jung's near-death experience will never be able to be reproduced. Similar experiences can be had, but that one is unique to him. He can explain it, we can see parallels between other explanations, but it can't be reproduced in a laboratory. Neither can a psychedelic experience. Anyone's unique experience will be unique to them, but it is easier to give people psychedelic drugs than to induce a near-death experience in them. There's been movies about people playing with near-death experiences, stopping each other's hearts. I forget the movie. There's medical students, and they would put themselves into cardiac arrest and then bring themselves back. They would have near-death experiences. Well, that's one way to kind of make near-death experiences more scientifically reproducible. But psychedelics, I think, is safer than that. And Stanislav Grof participated in the last legal psychedelic research program in the United States, which was at the Psychiatric Research Institute in Baltimore, Maryland, where he was given a license to give, I believe it was psychedelic mushrooms, to terminal cancer patients to help them come to terms with the fear of death. The reports had been that psychedelic drugs ease people's fear about the afterlife. It gives them confidence that they will continue in some way or another. And so that was the reason for the test. So having said that, let's look at a little bit about what Stanislav Grof said about using psychedelics in psychiatric research. So he said that, all right, so he gave, I'm just going to read here from the book on page 124. So after Grof's first LSD trip, he conducted clinical analyses of thousands of patients under the influence of psychedelic drugs, mainly LSD 25. This is a quote from one of his books. First in Czechoslovakia in the Psychiatric Research Institute in Prague, and then in the United States at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center in Baltimore, where I participated in the last surviving American psychedelic research program. So he uses the word holotropic, which means moving in the direction of wholeness, to describe the experiences people have under the influence of psychedelic drugs, also breathing techniques and near-death experiences. And so comparing LSD research to Leonard Suskind's holographic string theory, is that a valid comparison? I support my claim that it is, because by quoting from the hardback cover of Suskind's book, The Black Hole War, so right above that is a quote from the New York Times Book Review, which says, "This is your universe on acid." And in The Cosmic Landscape, Susskind said he did take LSD at the University of California in Berkeley during the 1960s. The New York Times Book Review says, okay, give the universe LSD and you'll have what Leonard Susskind describes with his holographic string theory. Well, in fact, Stanislav Grof took LSD and did experience something very similar to Leonard Suskind's holographic string theory version of cosmology. And here's another supporting quote about the utility of comparing psychedelic experiences to holographic string theory. This one comes from Michio Kaku, who I've quoted many times in this book and in previous videos, and he says, "A trip to a black hole would be fantastic, almost psychedelic. It's like having a near-death experience." So that's a perfect quote to support what I'm trying to do. I'm comparing near-death experiences and psychedelic experiences to the cosmology of information conservation and event horizons of black holes and the cosmic horizon of the universe. So, moving along in the book here, I want to quote an experiment that Grof did with, or that at least that he talks about, with congenitally blind people, people born blind and then having verifiable experiences, visual experiences. So if, on page 133 of the book, he describes veridical out-of-body experiences had by blind people who had near-death experiences, and they could then recall details of electrical fixtures on the ceiling of the operating room, and they could describe the outside of the hospital from a bird's eye view. So they've never been able to see anything in their lives. After these near-death experiences, they can describe visual experiences that others say, yeah, that is what was there. How did you know? Now you could say, well, somebody explained it to them and then later they made a trick. I'm more inclined to believe that their consciousness rose out of their body and perceived these things directly, as they say. Now, this is another very important correlation with holographic string theory and near-death experiences. And that is that the information of any three-dimensional volume of space, according to Leonard Susskind and Gerard de Hooft, is recorded on the two-dimensional surface area in Planck-length bits of information densely packed on the two-dimensional surface area. But then when you go out to verify that information is there, it recedes to the next concentric boundary of the volume of space. So all of the information describing this room that I'm in is on the ceiling, walls, and floor. And then if I was to go out and try to measure the information, according to Susskind, it would recede to the next boundary, which I assume would be the atmosphere of Earth, and then on out to the halo of the galaxy, ultimately terminating at the horizon of the cosmos. So people often recall after these near-death experiences that they rose above their body and they were looking down at themselves specifically from the ceiling. I talked to one person, a friend of mine, who was in a coma for I forget how long, but he said during that period he was looking at himself on the hospital bed from a panoramic perspective, not just from above, but from every direction simultaneously, which he thought was very bizarre. And a lot of people, they feel themselves rising above. It's slow at first, then faster and faster. But that information conservation specifically at the ceiling and walls of the room, it's got a very close correlation with what people recall during near-death experiences. So here's one example of that. In his book, Synchronicity, an A-Causal Connecting Principle, Jung recalls a near-death experience that one of his patients had when she was having a cesarean childbirth. And she said, or he said about her recollection, the remarkable thing was that it was not an immediate perception of the situation through indirect or unconscious observation, but she saw the whole situation from above, as though her eyes were in the ceiling, as she put it. So that I think, would explain there's another big parallel between holographic string theory and near-death experiences. All right, so here's a quote from Stanislav Grof when he's writing about near-death experiences. And he says, many accounts of NDEs, so NDE is near-death experience, refer to what appears to be a point of no return. This threshold may take a concrete form, a fence, body of water, cliff, or some other type of barrier, or involve simply a strong sense of an invisible but nevertheless compelling obstruction. Reaching this limit is associated with a convincing feeling that continuing beyond this point would mean physical death and would make return into one's body impossible. So there's another big correlation with the holographic string theory cosmology and near-death experiences. So people feel themselves hurtling through space until they reach a certain border, which they might experience as a fence or a gate or just an invisible point of no return that they feel if they go beyond there, they won't get to go back. And a lot of times they don't want to go back into their bodies once they've reached that point. But if we're correlating this with the cosmology, 21st century cosmology, and we're saying consciousness is interwoven with space-time, or space-time is just another word for consciousness, then that point of no return would equate to the horizon of the cosmos, where space is expanding at the speed of light. So after that point, if you go beyond the horizon of the cosmos, space is expanding faster than light. Not even light can get back into the universe. And it seems that's what people are experiencing during these near-death experiences. Okay, so I want to move to Pim van Lommel for a moment. His book, Consciousness Beyond Life, The Science of the Near-Death Experience. So he, as a cardiologist, he's saying, you know, I'm a scientific man. I'm not a superstitious person, but I've talked to people who've had heart attacks under my care. They've had these experiences. I believe them. Is it scientifically viable? Their explanations. Does it have any kind of scientific validity whatsoever? And he believes it does. And he talks about, for example, the case of Pamela Reynolds, who I know the BBC broadcasting company did a documentary on her because she had a near-death experience while her brain was being monitored for electrical activity. It was under surgery. She had a brain aneurysm. They had to cool her blood and release it from an artery in her leg so that they could deflate the aneurysm. When they did that, she said she felt as if her consciousness popped out of her head, and she was looking down at the operation from her doctor's shoulders, and she described them cutting her head with a special drill, which is like a vibrating circle, like some kind of a saw, and they saw her cutting her leg, and they didn't know why. She didn't know why they were doing that. Anyway, the doctors and nurses confirmed what she said. She couldn't have seen them do it because her eyes were smeared with lubricant and taped shut. Her ears had electrical devices in there making constant clicking noises so that they could monitor her brain activity, which there wasn't any. If her brain would respond to that clicking, they'd know her brain is active, but it wasn't. So she was physically blinded and deafened, and yet she perceived the whole situation. And then it was confirmed later on that she was unconscious. Her brain was not active at the time. And then afterwards, she went on to describe the typical near-death experience of being pulled extremely quickly through a tunnel toward an incredibly attractive pinpoint of light, and then knowing that she couldn't go beyond that or into that light and still return. So that was one of the examples that Pim van Lommel talks about in his book. He talks about a few examples from other people, but one thing I want to say is here's where he theorizes about the quantum vacuum being the source of consciousness. He says, this absolute vacuum, this non-local space, could be a basis or foundation for consciousness. I support the interpretation that this non-local space is more than a mathematical description. It is also a metaphysical space in which consciousness can exert influence because it has phenomenal properties. All right, so the quantum vacuum, which I've discussed in previous videos, the problem that confronts physicists when they study it is that the mathematics describing it imply it has an infinite amount of energy at each point, which would imply that it is made of miniature black holes, the Planck length, Planck scale black holes tightly, densely packed at the quantum vacuum. If you equate the psyche with the singularity, as I do, then that means the quantum vacuum is a sea of sentient mandalas, is how I describe it in the book. So I agree with van Lommel's equation of the vacuum with consciousness, but I'm focused more on the equation of consciousness with the central singularity and the collective unconscious with the surrounding horizon of the cosmos. And if we revert back to Plato's cosmology, which we've discussed before, the archetypes, or the absolute ideas of the soul, project the three-dimensional world into existence. So the archetypes of the collective unconscious are equivalent to the ideas of the soul that Plato talks about. If space, time, and every material object we see is projected from its perfect form in the archetypal realm, and if all of the archetypes are interwoven at the horizon of the cosmos, that would make sense that the three-dimensional universe is projected from our collective unconscious archetypes if we equate that collective unconscious mind with the horizon of the cosmos that Leonard Susskind describes. So, I'll come back and quote from Monique Hennecken, whom van Lommel describes her near-death experience. But I want to first describe in some more detail the tunnel vision and how succinctly that correlates with the aberration effect described by special relativity and gravitational lensing described by general relativity. So here is from Grof's book, The Ultimate Journey. He says, many of the accounts included descriptions of passage through a dark enclosed space, referred to as a funnel cave tunnel, followed by encounters with divine light. Out-of-body phenomena were some of the most common characteristics of near-death experiences. Many dying individuals mentioned in Dr. Raymond Moody's study reported encounters with other beings, such as dead relatives or friends, guardian spirits, or spirit guides. Visions of the being of light were especially common. Some accounts spoke of reaching some absolute border or limit where the decision had to be made as to whether to return or to continue the journey to the beyond, and usually the deeper they got, the less they wanted to return. So traveling through the tunnel towards a brilliant point of light is a very common near-death experience recollection. So I want to read, here's a quote from van Lommel's book. All right, so he says, this is two different people. One of them said, as I peered into the dark, the color changed from black to deep blue, not dark, but an intense cobalt blue that leaves you speechless. Soon I found myself in a dark space, a kind of tunnel. A glimmer of light appeared at the end, and after a real struggle I stood or found myself in this absolute light, which seemed to envelop me. Another person who had a near-death experience recalled that I entered an extremely dark, long, and spiral-shaped tunnel. I soared through the spiral-shaped funnel, and the further or the higher I got, the lighter it became. The intensity of the light changed to a deep purple-violet. Above me I saw an extremely bright, radiant white light. I whirled, floated toward it. So, the idea of this cobalt blue, this purple-violet light that people experience as they're hurtling down this dark tunnel, I want to compare that to the aberration effect described by the astronomer Karen Masters. So she said that if you were inside a black hole looking away from the central singularity, and if, she says, you could see an infinite blue shift, so the red shift, blue shift of light, galaxies that are receding faster from us, that are farther away and therefore receding faster, seem red shifted toward the red spectrum of light, because the light waves are being pulled and stretched because they're farther away. The galaxies that are closer seem more blue shifted because the wavelengths of light aren't so stretched out, they're more condensed. And the blue spectrum of light is the more high intensity, closer wavelengths when they're closer together, and the red shift, the red end of the spectrum, they get stretched out. So if you're inside a black hole, the light is coming in faster than the speed of light. It would achieve infinite blue shift at the center of a black hole. So here's what she says. She says, if you could see light which has an infinite blue shift, we would be able to see the whole universe in one small patch of our sky, even the stuff that is actually behind the singularity. And then she also says we would be able to see the evolution of the universe flash before our eyes. So the entire evolution of the universe, from the birth of the universe at the Big Bang to whatever the end point of the universe is, if you were inside a black hole looking out, you could see the whole universe, the whole history simultaneously. And furthermore, all of the light of the universe would seem to be condensed in a single point at the end of a dark tunnel. That is the gravitational lensing effect described by general relativity. The aberration effect is the same thing. If you're traveling through space, so acceleration through space is equivalent to gravity. The gravity of a black hole can be achieved if you accelerate towards the speed of light. So I'll read from another astronomer who describes traveling through space instead of being close to a black hole. Alexis Brandiker. He creates a hypothetical situation in which an astronaut named Celesta is in a spaceship traveling through space closer and closer to the speed of light, and he says that she would see how the whole field of view seems to shrink in the direction of travel. Even photons from stars that Celesta knows are behind come in from the forward direction. This is the effect of aberration. And then he goes on to say that if she could travel at 0.99999, a bunch of nines, the speed of light, she would see all of the radiation of the universe emanate from a single point in the direction of travel, and all radiation, even the cosmic background, would be Doppler shifted out to gamma ray wavelengths or far radio with next to nothing in between. So, the parallels that we're accumulating between Leonard Suskind's holographic string theory and near-death experiences, as well as out-of-body experiences induced by psychedelic drugs, are as follows. First, the information, people perceive themselves at the ceiling or the walls of the room. They rise above their body and look down and see everything from the perimeter of the room. That's what holographic string theory says you'd see. Or it just says the real information is at the boundary, the two-dimensional surface area of any three-dimensional volume of space. Another parallel is that people feel themselves slowly rising above their body and then gradually accelerating. That is similar to the physics of expanding space-time. So the fabric of space-time is expanding at an exponential rate. So people feel themselves rise above their body, then above the planet, and then they're hurtling through space. They see stars whizzing past them, and then they experience this, not all, but many experience traveling through a dark tunnel towards this all-attractive point of light, which is very similar to the aberration effect predicted by special relativity and gravitational lensing predicted by general relativity. Then people at this outermost border, this point of no return, which is similar to the way space is expanding faster than light at the cosmic horizon, so not even light could return to the universe. So people experience what appears to be the cosmic horizon as what it is, a point of no return. Then they experience the past, the present, and the future of the whole universe, including their own personal biographies as well as the biography of the universe itself, which is very similar to Leonard Suskind's holographic information conservation, his theory of holographic information conservation at the horizon of the cosmos. And then fewer near-death experiences, but some, most especially Carl Jung's, and the myth of that Plato describes at the end of the Republic, describe that information recorded at the horizon of the cosmos being projected back into the interior volume of the universe on fundamental threads, what Plato called threads of destiny, and what Carl Jung just recalled. It seems to me as if we're each in our own little cube, our own little box of imprisonment of three-dimensional space, tethered to the horizon by a thread. So if you're looking for these parallels between psychology and physics, I think they are most profound when you're comparing near-death experiences and psychedelic drug-induced out-of-body experiences to all of the physics that go into holographic string theory, which includes special relativity, general relativity, and quantum mechanics. All right, so that is the major parallels. Now, I just want to read, before signing off here, a couple more of people's actual near-death experiences, and it'll just verify the things that we've been saying. So here's another near-death experience account from Van Lommel's book. She says, "I felt that I was letting go of my body and rising up. Through the roof, over the hospital, everything became smaller, and I began to accelerate. Everything around me was dark, with the exception of several stars that hurled toward me, and I noticed their different colors. Then I realized that I wasn't alone, because a flow of translucent beings was heading the same way as me, and another flow was moving in the opposite direction. When I thought about reincarnation, it later dawned on me that it could well be this flow. An overwhelming feeling of love came over me, not the earthly feeling I was quite familiar with, but something I can't describe. Above me, I saw a bright light, and on my way there, I heard beautiful music, and I saw colors I'd never seen before." Okay, so that idea of one flow of translucent beings going one way and another coming the other way reminded her of reincarnation. That's very similar to Plato's The Myth of and Plato's Republic, where the soldier who woke up on his own funeral pyre, he said that he saw two openings in the heavens and two openings on the earth, and that souls were coming up from one of the holes on the earth, and souls were coming down from one of the holes in the heavens, and the ones coming down told of how blessed their afterlife was. The ones coming back up were covered in soot and grime, and they were horribly traumatized and shivering as they told about the horrors of the underworld. So the implication is that these souls had been sucked through these long tunnels, and they went on a long journey that it's described in the Republic. That is similar to what the near-death experience account that I just described, to what she said. Also, this feeling of love for this point of light, I equate that in the book to the cosmologist Brian Swim's equation, gravity is love. So he at one point said gravity is love, and he took some, people teased him a little bit about that. It sounds, oh, gravity is love. Oh, that sounds nice. But, and even I said, oh, gravity is love. Does that mean, electromagnetic radiation is hate, or does every single physical force of nature have some psychological equivalent? Well, actually, I think it does. And the more I thought about it, the more this gravity is love makes sense, at least in terms of the equation Psyche equals singularity. So a singularity is a point of infinite love. If gravity is love, then a singularity is infinite love. And that is exactly what people say they experience as they're hurtling through this dark tunnel towards this all-embracing, all-loving point of light at the end of the tunnel, which contains all of space and time. All right, so in the next video, I'm going to be going over Eben Alexander, so a neurosurgeon who taught at Harvard, and he became famous in 2012 when he described his near-death experience, which he said is especially important given his training as a neurosurgeon and his previous skeptical attitude. Now he believes in a soul and God, and I will talk about that in the next video.